And welcome to the program. And some of you may know that back in mid-April, I spent 2 programs talking to Michelle Bachmann, who recently stepped down from office, having served a number of years in the U.S. House of Representatives. And Michelle does what this program likes to do. She tells the inconvenient truth. And thus there was pushback. And that's putting it mildly. And we also talked about end-time issues in the world and the church. By the way, in the world and the church, that's fair game for mockery. But the comments went so far up the critical chain that the President of the United States even joined in on some of the mockery.
It gets worse. Just this week, Michelle Bachmann actually predicted that I would bring about the biblical end of days. Now that's a legacy. That's big. I mean, Lincoln, Washington, they didn't do that.
In studio with me, who are going to discuss this for just a few minutes. Eric Barger is my co-host today. Producer Larry Kutzler will be joining in. Eric Barger, by the way, thank you for coming in today for this rather delicate little discussion we're having.
And I think what we have seen here in what President Obama said at the Correspondents' Dinner in April, what was said there to me is exactly what is being talked about in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 8, for those who want to run and get a Bible and look. It says that knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts, saying, where is the promise of his coming? That's really what this is all about. It's a mockery of the truth. It was an opportunity for him to slam a political opponent, and one that I'm sure he's glad is out of Washington. She probably is. She's glad to be gone probably too, but She did great service while she was there. But this is a scoffing and mocking that 2 Peter 3 speaks of, Jan.
That's right. And let me just read a couple of paragraphs what some of these outfits have written. In this Examiner.com says, again, referring to the 2 programs that were done on Understanding the Times Radio back in mid-April, former Representative Michelle Bachmann made some statements last week regarding the rapture and President Obama that have some scratching their heads and others doubling over in laughter. And then they quote the Huffington Post reported on April 20th that Bachmann, a darling of ultra-conservative wing of the Republican Party, made the comments during the radio show End Times. Well, that's really not what the name of this program is. It's Understanding the Times. And then they go on to say the show is hosted by Jan Markell, a fundamentalist Christian who is obsessed with eschatology and the end of the world. Bachmann was a guest on the program, and during which she blamed Obama for ushering in the end of the world. Again, folks, not obsessed with the end of the world. We are very focused on making sure people are ready for the end of the world. Daily Kos, rejoice, the rapture is coming. Former Representative Michelle Bachmann is very excited that the world may be coming to an end. Iran may be getting the bomb. Gay people are getting married these days. And all of this is wonderful news because it means Israel is going to be destroyed and there will be wars and plagues and famines. And that means Jesus is going to come back to fly all the bestest Bachmann approving of Christians into heaven while her enemies get left to rot in whatever post-nuclear wasteland comes next. You think we are making this up? We are not making this up. That from the Daily Kos. Headline, rejoice, the rapture is coming. Larry Kutzler, as a pastor, you were pastor for 30 years. How do you respond to something like this?
Well, 25 years ago, I think people would not be mocking because they know that the scriptures talking about the end times were real. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was in the early 70s, the reason I became a Christian was because of Hal Lindsey and the discussion back then about the end times. And many, many, many young people came to know the Lord because the pulpits were talking about the end times issues. But, you know, Eric and Jan, we know that we will be judged in the last days by what we believe. The rapture, the return of Jesus, and the judgment of God. These are all strong biblical themes. So I guess we're in good company if they want to make fun of us. But the point is that they're there. 27% of the Bible has to do with end times or prophecy. So Michelle was right in what she said. It's just that they don't want to believe the truth.
You know, just like so many else in the world, too, they want want a sliver of Christianity when it fits into their worldview and their mold, but they don't want the whole thing. They don't want to understand that these are things that the Scripture speaks about and actually tells us to be watching for.
That's right.
This ministry, Olive Tree, my personal ministry, yours, Larry, our ministries talk about these things because this is what God has called us to do. He hasn't called everybody to talk about these same issues, but He's called us to do it. They say we're obsessed. That struck me, Jan. They're obsessed with some of the opposite stuff that we're exposing. And then, we're talking about this not just to yell about our opponents. We're using this as a teaching moment to say, folks, don't worry about what the world says about us. Don't get caught up in the thinking that you need to shut your mouth and not talk about these things for fear they'll look at you like you're some kind of a Fruit Loop. What you need to do is continue on the same path and keep watching and praying for Jesus' return.
And one of the things that I think is very important to note is that Jesus said before He comes back, it will be like the days of Noah. Days of Noah were totally incomplete. The people were unaware. And I think the churches are totally unaware because so many pastors and leaders in those pulpits are not preparing the people for what Jesus said would eventually happen. That is, the world is getting ready for His return. And so many pastors say, well, it's too confusing. There's too many points of view. But that is not an excuse for not preparing the people for the ultimate return of Jesus.
I was disappointed that even the Christian world had to get in on the slamming. And I often read, and I know you do too, Eric, because we read a lot of the same news sources, the Christian Post. And they had a couple of stories on this same topic. And headline, New Christian Zionists Seek to Distance from Wild, Crazy, Popular Apocalypticism. And they go on to say, and I'm just reading a few lines from these articles, folks. They're long articles just excoriating people who believe like those of us do in this ministry, and that the positions that Michelle Bachmann put forth again on this program for 2 programs back in April. But this Christian Post goes on to say, a group of Christian scholars representing a new Christian Zionism seek to distance their views from the wild, crazy, popular apocalypticism with which Christian Zionists have often been associated. Goes on to say 11 speakers, mostly theologians, presented at the April 17th conference, People of the Land, a 21st Century Case for Christian Zionism, hosted by the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And then it winds up saying, this apocalypticism was also on display recently when former Congresswoman and presidential candidate Michelle Bachmann said on a radio program, Understanding the Times, that the end times were near and associated that prediction with Barack Obama's foreign policy. Well, again, and that's coming from the Christian right, so even they are jumping on the bandwagon of the bashing campaign. MSN.com, Obama's poor relationship with Israel will bring the return of Jesus. That was their headline. The ever-ready right-wing watch, End times are here, thanks Obama. Huffington Post, the rapture is coming and it's Obama's fault. And gentlemen, the thing I thought of is God will use any old donkey to get this kind of a message out. He'll use any vehicle to get the important message out that the King is coming. Are you ready? Are you looking up? Are you longing for His return? Is the ultimate message of the King is coming.
I said a minute ago, Jan, that we expect this kind of thing from the left-wing media and the pundits who want to use this as a tool just to bash Christians in general. What they really want to do is divide Christians as much as anything. But shame on whoever the author was, and I don't have that article right in front of me. If it was he or she, I would say their name if I had it here. Shame on the person who wrote that in Christian Post. This is not apocalyptic. This is right from the Scriptures. And all we're doing is examining the Scriptures, as the Bereans were, of course, very good at, and that's why we use that term Berean about someone who studies the Scriptures to find out what God is saying. All we're saying is look at the signs around us. Look in the Bible. Something is going on. That's all we can do is commentate about those things and let the Scriptures lead us every week. It is the people inside the church that really concerns me. And Jan, you and I have heard Dr. Dave Reagan, our friend, make the statement that he got up to preach one Sunday morning and told people to turn open the Bible to the book of Daniel. And the pastor stood up in the front row and said, Dr. Reagan, we don't use that book in this church. And Dr. Reagan's response is, well, we do this morning. You can just hear him saying it. And he went ahead and preached from Daniel that morning. But that's just an example. There are churches all over the place won't read anything from Revelation, from Daniel, Ezekiel, etc.
That's right. I think the greater question probably is this. Is serious persecution of Bible believers coming to America? Now, many would say it's already here because we know there are Christian businesses being shut down because the intolerance tolerant crowd is closing down bakeries, flower shops, etc. I saw the headline recently in the Christian Post, might have been an editorial, Dear Churches in America, prepare to be treated like first-century Christians in Rome. And the United States Supreme Court may soon liberate the biblically conservative church from old prejudices that should have long ago jettisoned, forcing it into rightly bowing to the enlightenments of modernity, in the words of the recent New York Times. And then again, homosexuality must be removed from the sin list, and according to MSNBC commentator, traditional marriage proponents must be forced to do things they don't want to do. Goes on, sadly, this crusade will be like the Marxist liberation movements that promised to free people, but really were about control and suppression. And Eric, you and I were talking here recently about what Hillary Clinton said here just a few weeks ago. In a sense, what she wants to do with religious people in America.
April 23rd, on Thursday of that week, Women in the World Summit in New York City. This is what Hillary Clinton said. I have the quote here. Far too many women are denied access to reproductive health care and safe childbirth, and laws don't count for much if they're not enforced. Rights have to exist in practice, not just on paper. Now listen to this, folks. Laws have to be backed up with resources and political will, and deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs, and structural biases have to be changed. What she's saying is, forget what the Bible says. You've got to listen to us and follow what we say, or, we're going to do something, whatever that might be, arrest. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what she's thinking. We know that's coming, but that's like, a foreshadowing of what Antichrist is going to do right there.
Heard so many commentators, including Jan Markell herself, that have said that America is ripe for judgment. And we have been beginning to look at the 2016 election and saying, if the wrong people get in office again, it may be much worse than our current administration. And really, the judgment of God will come through the leaders that we as Americans will elect in 2016. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, I agree, Larry, completely.
Here's what I hear from those emailing this ministry. Of course, I hear lots of things, but a theme over and over and over again is I want to hear in my church, I want to hear the things that your program, Understanding the Times Radio, with your hosts, Jan, Eric, Jill, Larry, all of you, I want to hear what you folks are talking about, frequently anyway, in my church. I want to hear that the King is coming. I want to hear that we have a glorious future, a glorious eternity that is prepared for us. I want to hear that we're going to live forever on streets of gold. We hear none of this in my church. I just had an email minutes ago saying the same thing. She pleaded with him to talk about these things. He just said to her, you know what? We don't and won't talk about these things. And then he gave her some of the reasons. So I think, gentlemen, when we come forth with a couple of programs, as we did back in mid-April with former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, and we were simply talking about the times as they are today and how they are preparing the way for the fact that the King is coming sooner rather than later. This ultimately was a very uplifting two programs. However, the secular and in a couple of cases the Christian, and certainly the Christian Post, twisted it and made it a mockery. But again, you said so appropriately, that is 2 Peter 3 jumping out at us.
It really is, And